Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk Horror and Magical Realism. Today we have Andrew K. Clark. Hi, Andrew. Nice to have
Hi.
you. And you've
Yeah,
got
very good to be here.
you've got a debut novel coming out soon, Where Dark Things Grow. I see the cover back there, and I have it
Yeah.
on. I have the
Nice.
advanced copy
Nice.
here. So very exciting. And first, I'll introduce everybody to you and your
Yeah.
background, and we'll dig into some questions and talk about your book and your other works too. So,
Yeah, great.
coming from you, Andrew K. Clark is a writer from Western North Carolina, where his people settled before the Revolutionary War. His poetry collection, Jesus in the Trailer, was published by Main Street Rag Press, was shortlisted for the Able Muse Book Award. Amazing. Congrats.
Thank you.
And your debut novel, Where Dark Things Grow, is forthcoming from Cowboy Jamboree Press, September 2024.
Yes, just
Coming up
a couple
fast.
of weeks.
So, congratulations for that. And so, this book is, as you call it, a horror and magical realism story set in 1930s Asheville and Western North Carolina. And I'm a fellow Appalachian. I grew up in East Tennessee. I live in LA now, but I
Yeah,
often went to Western North Carolina. Was there last year in
nice.
Asheville and up in the mountains. So when I was reading this, I found a lot of kinship in it. But we'll get to the story in a bit. First, I want
Okay.
to talk about you and your upbringing and what got you started into writing.
Yeah, so I grew up, like I said, like you said, I grew up in Western North Carolina, so just outside of Asheville. My people have been here for many generations. They came to Western North Carolina from Scotland in 1739 on my dad's side, but my mom's side was mostly Scottish, Irish, also some British and so forth. But um, so how did I come to writing? So I think that the first writing I came to was poetry, and that you can kind of see with my first book was a collection of poetry called Jesus in the Trailer. Um, the sort of pivotal moment for me was when I was in high school. Someone gave me the complete Langston Hughes,
Oh, wow.
and before that, like poetry to me was Shakespeare, rhyming and things like that, and so it never felt like particularly accessible to me. But what I found with Langston Hughes is he used free form, free verse most of the time. There's absolutely some rhythm and
Yeah.
syntactical things he does there. But one thing that I was drawn to is he writes in his own vernacular, right? And so to me, that kind of like rang a bell that, oh,
Yes.
I can write in my vernacular. If I wanted to be a writer, I wouldn't have to try to sound like Shakespeare or try to have this elevated language or whatever. I could write like people talk. So that was a moment for me. So I did start writing poetry in high school, had some poetry published in college and so forth. And along the way, even before I discovered poetry, I was a big reader. So I had read all the fantasy books I could get my hands on in the library. I was a big Tolkien fan, a big C.S. Lewis fan, things like that. So I was always kind of drawn to the magical elements, supernatural elements, things like that. And then as I got into college, majored in English and so forth, and discovered, great magical realism writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Salman Rushdie, and Murakami. And so I kind of started to see this cross pollination.
Right.
Later, I discovered, finally got to the local South, Southern Appalachian writers and read people like Ron Rash and Charles Frazier and Daniel Woodrell, and just became like, really enamored with that. So I think my writing journey is sort of like an amalgamation of these things that I read and discovered and connected with. And so to me, what I'm doing with this book and what I kind of did with the poetry book and some of the work that's coming is mix that sense of like a really strong the Appalachian writers have this very strong sense of place, right?
Right.
It defines the region, it defines the people, it defines the storytelling, history, and all those things. And so, what I think that I'm doing with my work is sort of combining those things that I'm drawn to. So there's the love of poetry, the love of like a well-crafted sentence. There's the realism, the gritty realism of Appalachia, particularly in this novel. 1930s Appalachia really kind of speaks to the way my grandparents grew up. And they
Yeah.
grew up in that period. They were teenagers during the Great Depression. And um, and then mixing in what I saw in Murakami and Marquez, or the magical with the real. So that's always kind of interested me in terms of my writing. Still love a great fantasy book, still love, a great literal, book, set in, grounded in the real world. Love to consume all that stuff, but in my work, I enjoy sort of bending genre a little bit and mixing
Yes.
those things together.
I completely understand that's kind of what I do as well. So
You do, and you bring in the sci-fi too, which is kind of cool. I
yeah,
love
I've
that.
always been a nerd. So one thing I wanted to dig into, you also have aspects of horror here that are,
Yes,
always kind of at first they're a bit on the fringe and then they become very much to the fore. And,
right.
it's reading along and where dark things grow. I just got this sense of building dread. I was like just becoming uneasy, you know, and
Yeah,
I wanted to talk a little bit about that, and you've mentioned the magical realism influences, but let's talk about your horror influences. Like, where were you when you were developing as a writer, as a reader, and then, funneling that into this great book? Where are your
yeah.
horror influences coming from?
Yeah, I've had those really since college, and one of the first horror writers I read was obviously Stephen King. A lot of us are kind of children of King,
Cut our
and
teeth on
so I read
King.
a lot. I read everything I get my hands on. Went on to Anne Rice, and then of course in more recent years, like Stephen Graham Jones,
Yeah,
and then one of
right.
my favorite horror writers that I hope more folks sort of discover and connect with is Andy Davidson.
Yeah,
He is a Georgia writer, and so if I were to say like an aspiration, like I would say like I would hope to write stories like Andy Davidson, Stephen Graham Jones, but in the South. So
yeah,
with Andy Davidson, he's got one book kind of in like the bayou, right, the
right.
swamps, the bookkeeper's daughter, and then he has this great novel set in Georgia. And again, the land is almost like a character in itself, like a great
Yes.
or a traditional Southern writer, but the land is itself haunted. So that's something that I think comes through in where dark things grow. But always been a huge fan of horror movies. One of my favorites is The Exorcist,
Yeah.
and I think in my novel there's some religious elements that kind of
Yes.
overlay, and so some of that stuff in horror attracts me. I'm less of a maybe slasher fan
Right.
than I am sort of the more gothic
Yeah.
types of horror. Yeah.
Well, and in some ways, I'm picking up on a bit of cosmic horror here as well. There's
Yes.
there's a little bit of, of that's kind of, I mean, that to me is something in Appalachia that I just sort of picked up on. And I've written
Yeah.
stories that are cosmic horror based in Appalachia. And I think that I wanted to get your take on this, that for me, the Appalachian Mountains are older than the rings of Saturn. So
Right.
these are deep, deep rooted, ancient hills and
Yes.
highlands and valleys. And in the hollers, where my family came from, Southwest Virginia, East Tennessee, coal miner. I'm a coal miner's granddaughter.
Oh, okay.
So, there was always that sense of unease that you kind of felt like there was something much older than you out in the wilderness in Appalachia. But if you respected it, if you kind of stepped back, and I'm a woman of science, but I pick up on this sort of thing
Yeah.
like, okay, nature there runs deep, nature persists. The southern Appalachians didn't get glaciation to the level that the northern areas did. So you have
Hmm.
remnant species that are so ancient,
Yes.
and there's more endemic species in Appalachia. I have an ecology degree
Oh, I love that.
from
Yeah.
University of
You can
Tennessee.
teach me a
So,
lot.
and I think of all these things kind of blending together, and you're channeling that, and the richness of the environment, and the feeling that there are ancient things that work, but there's also, the newer influences, and, the collision of the spiritual, the religious, and the ancient all kind of together in this book. And I really loved that. And I loved how it's sort of allegorical, really,
Hmm.
that and there's parables going on, this is
Hmm.
deep lore, this is deep mountain lore, to be
Yes.
precise. And even the Wolvers, like when I was growing up, and this is one thing that was a trip reading this, because, we're from the same general area.
Right.
And there's a lot of through line of these mountain legends. And I swear to you, I've heard of the Wolvers.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't
I
know from where, like, Jonesboro, which was very close to Gray, which was the town I grew up in Tennessee, where the storytelling festival is. This was the kind of stuff that you would hear there. This is the kind of stuff that my grandparents would talk about,
Hmm.
and and when my grandfather was up in the mountains mining coal, talking about strange creatures screaming in the night, things like
Yes.
that.
Yes.
So, let's dig into that a little bit. Did you have any family sort of legends and tales that kind of influenced this?
That I'd heard of the Wolvers, and I think there's like chatter about them. And part of the reason is Appalachia settled by the Scottish Irish, right? And so, or at least Southern Appalachia, right?
Right.
And so Wolvers originate, like the idea of them, this wolf that can walk on its hind legs,
Yeah.
originate really in Scotland, from what I can, best I can tell. And so some of those myths and lore kind of carry over.
Right.
But there is always the sense with Appalachian Mountains being like this. It's the most ancient mountain range on the planet, as you said. And so there's always this idea of like it's a little bit alive and in and of itself. And this, we talk about the screamers and the skinwalkers, and there's all these cryptid things about Appalachia. And as you said, like we might hear the screaming, but we should just ignore it. So it's almost like if you leave it alone, it won't
Yeah.
bother you, kind of thing. And then I think too, like for me, I was raised in a very fundamentalist religious background. And so there was, people in my family, multiple generations that talked about the world in terms of like, the good versus evil.
Yes.
Something bad happened to you, that could have been the devil messing with you. Like
Right. Right.
literally the belief system that, the devil and God are kind of fighting over us, and maybe moving us like pawns a little bit. And, there's just this battle going on. And so, and what I saw with like some of the people that I grew up, talking to, and again, there's this oral tradition of people sharing stories.
Yeah.
There's sort of like this blending of the superstition
Yep.
with the religion, right? And so it wasn't sort of incongruous to think like there could be skinwalkers, there could be, things in the woods that nobody's ever seen. And also there's this religious, clear God and devil, right?
Right.
So I like the idea of kind of mixing those things together, and letting them kind of blend. But one decision I made early on in the book is I love sort of like superstition and lore and folklore and all those kind of things, but I tried to, as much as I could, use things that just came from like my personal like heritage. So that's one
Yes.
reason that I wanted to use the Wolvers and not some other things that maybe would be really popular in the United States, that maybe more Native American type tradition or something like that. And so that was really important to me. So even like my villain has a Norwegian, one of the
Right.
human villains has a Norwegian background. So that's ethnically in my background. So
Right.
I felt a little more comfortable just kind of excavating what I felt was my story to tell.
Yeah. Right. In our history and our framework. And, I, like you, I Scotch Irish background, good old
Yeah.
Ulster Scots. A lot of us from that area came over, back in the 1700s.
Hmm.
And I think I'm a daughter of the American Revolution, like one of the, I don't know. I'd have to ask my aunt. My aunt knows all the lines, and you know how that is. And of those of us from Appalachia, it's very important to trace down
Yes,
our heritage.
that's right.
And that's just a thing that we do. And so, one of the things that struck me, my parents were born in the 1930s and they grew up, dad talks about growing up in the Depression, and he was, um, his mother was a single mom, divorced when he was a year old, and so that was kind of unusual for that time. And
Yeah.
he had to kind of move around, and they were so poor. And my mom
Hmm.
came from a really big family, and then, she had us four. So like it was a very different dynamic, but it's interesting to see like how those different people were just trying to scratch out a living, in the
Oh yeah.
mountains in the 30s. It was hard. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about like when you're talking about your own family history, did your family struggle in that way?
Yeah, so one of the things that was sort of on my mind in choosing like this time period, it always fascinated me, right? So Asheville has this almost Gilded Age kind of history.
Right.
The Vanderbilts coming and building the Biltmore House, and
Yeah,
like
it was
there's
quite
this
something. Yeah.
huge, yeah, tourism is really big in the 20s and 30s, and
Yep.
people are coming here because they think the mountain air is good for your lungs, and
Exactly.
there's widespread TB, so they think that helps
I
with
mean,
that stuff. And so when F. Scott Fitzgerald's here, Zelda Fitzgerald is here, things like that. And so that's often the story that you hear and then there's this fall from grace with the Great Depression, right? So the National goes into this
Right.
era of struggle and disrepair, and that is addressed in the book. But one part I wanted to tell is like from my family history, my grandparents were so poor that the Great Depression had almost no impact.
Yeah, they were already there, right?
They're already there.
That was like
Yeah,
my
you're
dad and
struggling.
his
You
family.
got, a few chickens and you're,
Yeah.
tenant farming and that kind of thing. And so for them, there was no change. And so I think that's a story that's maybe not as well known as, and we're talking like today, like a drive of 15 minutes from Asheville to be in, just sort of abject poverty. But at the time, of course, it took a lot longer to make
Right,
some of these
exactly.
books. There certainly were automobiles in the 30s, but there was not roads, right?
Right.
And so, like some of the stories that my granddad told about the difficulty during that time made their way into the story. So, like, there's a piece in there where the main character is sleep in bed, and the sort of shack that they live in, the one room shack they live in, has sort of gaps in the roofing
Oh,
where the
falling right in.
boards of pearl. So the snow would come in and lay across their body. Well, that my granddad told that story. That's where I got that story
Yep.
from. So in his house, they had a wood stove and everything, but they couldn't afford to get the roof repaired, and kept trying to patch it, and it would leak and all the different things. And so he told the story of being in bed in the wintertime and snow coming in, and like there's a line across his body,
Yeah.
right? And you'd need to get like all the animals, the cats and everything, to try to like lay with you so you could stay warm.
Right.
Um,
So
and
it
so
was.
that those things really interested me in terms of his upbringing. Like it was hard for me to relate to, sort of growing up in a
Yeah.
more middle class family. But his stories fascinated me. So some of those made their way, into the novel. And some people, sort of when I had like beta readers read it, they would say like, "Well, this doesn't seem very realistic." Like that happened to my
Oh, that
grandfather.
was for real.
Yeah, that was for real. An
Yeah.
example would be he lost a brother. His brother died, and what killed him was an infected blister on his foot.
So
And you
sad.
think like, well, how does that happen? Well, there wasn't like healthcare,
Didn't
their
have
antibiotics
penicillin
weren't
available in the
widespread.
mountains. Yeah.
That's right. And so they use their sort of home remedies, and he passed away.
Yeah.
So it was, very my grandfather didn't talk about it a lot until you kind of try to excavate it, but the trauma of having like a brother that you go out and play with every day and then he's just dead. Like he gets sick and like within 7 days he's dead.
Yeah. Yeah.
So some of those things
Horrible.
made their way in, and again, they kind of speak to that realism side of the story.
It was a brutal time, and you're reflecting very well how hard it was.
Yeah.
And, it's I want to talk a little bit about Leo, who's the main
Mhm.
character of this book, and how you can channel rage in good and
Right.
bad ways, right? Because
Right.
he's just seen his mother go through all this. He's lost his brother, his father's just a mess and has gone off and who
Yeah.
knows where and all this and just trying to keep it together. He seems like the only person who really knows what's going on, who isn't
Mhm.
sick, who isn't mean, who isn't, in
Yeah.
his family. And he's just so stoic and so, you know, he's a survivor. He's a survivor. And
Mhm.
then he's channeling though. He has a lot of anger and it's justified. And
Mhm.
he's channeling that and that's sort of manifesting. And I haven't finished the book, but I'm far enough in to see the extraordinary power behind that. And I want to talk about, it how do you see that as as a power? It's like is if you were given the option to channel the power and the way that he does, I don't want to spoil it, would you take that chance? I want to know your perspective on that.
Yeah. So one of the things that a trope in storytelling is the sort of powerless person that gains power.
Yes.
And so that happens for Leo. He has mom that's kind of struggling. We would probably say she has mental health issues today. A sister that's sick, brother that had passed away, and then he has a missing father. So the family can't, the mother can't like feed them,
Can't cope, it can't
right?
do anything. Yeah.
Can't cope, and doesn't really get as much help that he thinks they should get from the church and from the relatives and
Right.
things like that. So when he has this ability to wield this power, his first thoughts are more benevolent, right? And I think a lot of us would be that way. You kind of have that um, idea about, we win the lottery or you gain power in some way, like, of course I would
Help
do
your
really
family,
good things and
get
go
you
help
some
my
new
family.
clothes,
And
get you a new,
yeah, and I would help people that are hungry in my town. And I would do,
right,
there's all these different things. And I'm not saying that people wouldn't do that, but one of the things that we see happen, both in storytelling and in real life, is that at some point, sometimes power can be corrupting. So I
right.
wanted to play with that a little bit. So what happens is he starts off with all these benevolent ideas, and I'm going to do these good things. And then he's like, oh, but those people weren't very nice to us. Maybe they should get a little bit of comeuppance,
Mhm.
right? So he goes down that path, and then it sort of snowballs a little bit in terms of like he kind of likes this, having this
Right,
power, and then there's a point where the power, he's like, is it turning against me, right?
right.
And so that it's playing it again. I think allegory is a good word. It's playing with the idea of like what happens when we have a powerless character suddenly gain a lot of power and be
Yeah,
able to do anything they want in a way, and what happens when they give over to their darker side, and can they like sort of claw them. And I'm not going to ruin it for you, but can Leo kind of claw his way out and
right.
sort of get back in the light again, or let go of his anger and hatred and all those things.
And that's hard because, he's been in a powerless situation for so long, and I think that's one thing that, there's definitely a Stephen King vibe in terms of that. I kind of
Mhm.
think back, I mean, obviously, I actually think of Firestarter more than some of the more
Yes.
obvious references, because I read that at a too young of an age, way too young.
I,
You know,
I did too. I mean, I did too. Yeah.
X. So,
So yeah, so that would be a great example. Yeah, and
yeah,
definitely a novel that I read in my 20s and absolutely loved. So you can see that those kind of influences come in.
yeah,
But yeah, I like the idea of that corrupting influence of power.
right.
And then
And
I like stories that address class,
yeah,
but not in a textbook kind of way, if
yeah,
that makes sense, or like a socioeconomic. Like I'm making this big statement about class, right? And I would rather kind of weave it into the story. So there's many occasions where you can see him kind of his family being discriminated against and treated
yes,
poorly and things like that.
yep,
But he never really we don't sort of the narrator doesn't help us understand that. It's just the reality of what they faced.
exactly. And that's something that I noticed growing up in Appalachia is like, there are class struggles there. We didn't,
Oh,
you
sure.
know, in my area, we thought of Asheville as like this distant and wonderful place. And I had been to Biltmore a few times as a kid, and just
Yeah.
seeing the dichotomy of, you see Biltmore there and you see a holler with a little shack that's just
Oh,
got,
yeah.
a
Yeah.
coal stove with a little trickle of smoke coming up, and a hog on the porch, even to this day. Like the coal mining towns of Appalachia, that's
Absolutely.
that's still there, and
Yeah.
nobody's thinking about those folks.
No, they're coming
Nobody's
to
thinking
town.
about them. They're thinking,
Well,
oh, in Asheville today, it's like, oh, I'm just gonna go down to the microbrewery. I'm gonna go,
yeah. Yeah.
get a latte. I'm not gonna think about it's all hip. It's happening in Asheville. It's such a cool city, which it is. But there's just everything is sort of chopped in these, distinct things. There's no outward thinking from either the holler or the city. There's
That's right.
no
That's right.
blending
They're
together.
like different worlds,
They
right?
really are,
And
and
they,
they're right next to each other. It's almost like
that's
they're
right.
parallel universes.
Yeah, and today, it's maybe the trailer parks and things like you get 30 minutes outside of Asheville. It's just a lot of poorer folks and struggling folks, and they have a very different perspective and experience of
Yeah,
living here and what it's like to be, Western North Carolinian and that kind of thing. And they
right,
are kind of forgotten. Tourists come to the city and they see one side of it. They don't really see that side of it.
right.
So very careful to kind of keep our homeless folks away from where the tourist folks are, right? That kind of thing, which is difficult issue to deal with.
Yeah,
But I think uh, I like that sort of those things coming together. So we see in the
yes,
story like Leo encounters like some very wealthy people, very powerful people, and
right,
some of them are doing some pretty bad things, and
exactly.
he gets drawn into that as well. And that's another. There's another example kind of from my grandfather's life that's in the novel, that when I had early beta readers say like, well, this wouldn't happen. And it happened to my grandfather. That is, in the story, Leo's taken to a brothel by
Mhm.
his dad, not like for patronage, but to like you
Right.
sit in the corner while dad goes upstairs kind of thing.
Yeah,
Right. Well, my great grandfather did that. Took my grandfather to these places, and the reason why was because his wife thought that the child being there would modulate his behavior.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh
And
my
so
goodness.
obviously that didn't work, right?
Oh,
So that worked its way in the novel, because I thought that was just such a fascinating thing for me,
yeah.
hearing my grandfather's
And
story.
you
It's
can't
like,
make
how
that
does this
stuff up. That's like
happen?
for real,
Yeah, it is real. Yeah.
So,
It's like, not, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have like
I
things
know.
like that
Yeah.
that's the way this business was conducted,
Yeah.
right?
And then I
So,
get a little bit of shade of like, from Forrest Gump of kind
mhm.
of like, what's the mother doing to keep things going?
Right.
She's
Yeah,
doing
that's
whatever she
right. And
can.
she's taken advantage of, and you sort of
You know?
see, how that happens, and
Yep.
sort of embroils Leo's anger as well, because
Right.
he doesn't want to see his mom being hurt and those kind of things. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so the family dynamics are like a big sort of trope in Southern literature in general. But I think particularly in Appalachia. So that's part of what I was trying to excavate here, these complicated feelings that
Yeah.
you have, that you have to deal with.
Yeah. And that really spoke to me because, like you, I've told people about my family history and all the wild stories that we have, and people don't believe them. And I'm like, listen, I saw it,
Right. Right.
it's there, and that you don't make this stuff up. Like, it is a very interesting place. It's juxtaposed against a lot of modernity, clashing with history, and a lot of things that just have never changed, but are suddenly thrust into this new era. And
That's
now
right.
now we can tell those stories with greater freedom than we had before, with greater accessibility.
I think
And
so.
I think
Yeah.
that people are starting to be like, oh, there's actually a pretty strong legacy there beyond just a couple of names. There's a lot of stories. There's a lot of
Yeah.
craft. There's a lot of art, obviously music.
Hmm.
And, and I'm talking old time in bluegrass. I'm not talking Nashville.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Yes.
So, and,
Mountains.
all of this is sort of, everybody's already a poet in Appalachia, whether they know
Hmm.
it or not. Everybody's already writing hymns, writing poems, writing epics, writing sagas, and blood connected to that, limestone and those caves and
Yes.
those high hills and those deep valleys and those hollers. So I feel like what I really appreciate about this book is that you've tapped into all of that, and subtly, to be quite honest. Like, it's not really, thrown in your face. It's, you get a sense immediately that there is something on the edge of
Hmm.
what we understand, and
Hmm.
it's sort of shimmering out there for good or ill. And, and here's a boy trying to do what's right by his family, trying to do what's right for these missing girls,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
struggling with his own, temptations and what have
Right.
you. And so it's just, it's a fascinating story, and I'm really glad you've written it because, I feel like finally somebody's talking about some of this stuff, and hence,
I appreciate that. And I think, there's certainly plenty of stories about, the poor Southern family and things like that. So that's nothing,
yeah,
particularly new. But I do think that, um, again, the Western North Carolina, like a lot of our storytelling, The Last Castle, things like that, and is a great, fine book, historical fiction about the Vanderbilts here. Again, in this particular area, that's more of the focus.
right,
So to me, I particularly like the idea of telling what it was like outside of the city, the rural
right,
folks who worked on farms, who did those kind of things, and then when those worlds collide. I think that's
yeah,
very interesting. And so that's
yeah,
sort of what happens. In the novel, you see Asheville sort of boom, right? When all the
right,
tourists are coming, and there's real estate speculation and things like that. And then the bust, right? So
right,
after the great,
yep,
you see Asheville after. And so to me, that's very interesting. So there's this fall from grace for the city, and then again for Leo and the people that in his community, nothing's changed.
yep.
Nothing's changed. Matter of fact, my grandfather would say that life got better in the Great Depression because his dad eventually got a job with the TVA
Well, yeah,
over in Tennessee. So then there was like
how the
money
authorities
coming,
were,
like he
right,
mails money home, right?
yep,
So that, like for most people, it was this devastating thing, and for his family, it's kind of like they're them scratching out existence. They could do
right,
it a little better with some help.
Yeah. And then like with my grandfather, coal was just bottoming out. And then so he moved over to East Tennessee from Southwest Virginia and started working, there, chemical company. We moved in,
Okay.
you know.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting era. It's like when my mother was born in the 30s, like my dad was born in the early 30s, she was born in the mid 30s. And so
Hmm.
it was just a very interesting transition time for Appalachia where like people were leaving the coal jobs
Yeah.
already
Yeah.
and then trying to figure out new place. And so, and then you did, they did scratch out a new existence that was better than what they
Yeah.
had been enduring.
Yeah, and for this area, we didn't have the coal mines, but the mountain people kind of came out of the hills and went places
Yeah.
like Gastonia and things like that, where there were
Yes.
textile mills, and that kind of thing. So it kind of go where the jobs were,
Exactly.
and so my grandfather had this migration over his life where he starts off, very very poor, but then starts businesses and things
Yeah.
like that later in life, and becomes middle class. And so, but he always held on to that. I think you probably saw this with your parents, but folks that grew up in that time period, like they had this sort of a scarcity mentality. It's always like that fear of
Oh yeah.
losing.
They were
And so,
hoarders.
oh yeah, you hoard and
Yeah.
you live well below your means. Like
Right.
you not like so even when my grandfather was more successful, like the outside world wouldn't have known, you know,
Exactly. Yes.
it stayed very frugal and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's how it was with my grandparents too. And it was, it was a very interesting, the two sets of grandparents. Well, it ended up being three because, my grandparents separately, who had divorced, like remarried and still had three sets of grandparents. And
Oh my goodness.
so it was kind of fun actually, as a kid. Uh,
Yeah, for a kid, it's great.
but they really went through it and just I like that you're telling stories about that era because
Hmm.
that's those are the stories that I listen to,
Yeah.
their knees, so to speak. And so, and I think too, what's really interesting about the class difference is that they're taken for granted. There's a
Hmm.
whole
Hmm.
rich history, there's a whole rich lore that because they weren't in the city or they weren't in the colleges or wherever they kind of got passed over. Those stories got passed over and died out with the people who lived them. So
Yes.
it's important to tell these kind of stories that
I
you're
think I think so, and again, like if you think about the sort of next generation, like my children, like they can't fathom some of
right.
these things. That they weren't there in the room when my grandfather's your grandparents telling stories and things like that. So I think it has value in that way as well. Even
It
though I'm
does.
couching it in this supernatural
Yep.
world, the setting is very realistic and
Yeah.
something that you can is tangible. It's
It's
not
absolutely tangible.
not
I
made
can
up.
smell that wood smoke. I can smell the snow in the air.
Yes,
I
yes,
know those smells.
yes,
That was
yes.
my home, right?
My
So,
grandma could walk outside and tell you whether it was going to snow or not,
yep,
and she was right. She's
yep,
always right. And I think I probably could because over time you gain experience. But
exactly.
as a kid, I was just like so fascinated that she could do
I
that.
know. Yeah.
I was
Smells
like,
like snow, and you're like, how do you know?
yeah, I know, I know.
So,
Well, it's cold, but how do you know?
no, and there is a snow smell. There is a smell in the air. Like one of
Uh-huh.
the things that you do learn about new and old places is trying to figure out like these different senses that we have and we just don't tend to use as much anymore.
That's right. That's right.
That's
Intuition, I think, is something that mountain people have
yeah,
in a way that's different. And it's like anything else, like the dialect and all those things, we're losing them, right?
yeah,
So you have a generation that is, we were obviously that TV generation where like our newscasters and everybody has this neutral accent, and we're trying to emulate that so that we don't look
right.
like hicks when we like leave the region. And I'd be interested in, sometime hearing more about your experiences leaving the region and living in LA and things like that. Like people have a certain perception of who you are. I've found traveling, and then now we have a generation where they're sort of getting like these, they're getting the same thing, that dilution of the accent through TikTok videos and
Exactly.
things like that.
Exactly.
That's where they're getting their influences, not
Yeah.
not their grandparents.
Oh, and I swear, like, when I was growing up, people thought I was from Michigan or something because I didn't sound like everybody else. And even though people
Yeah,
here
yeah,
can tell I have an accent, people there thought I was a Northerner. And I think
Yeah.
it's because I watched movies and TV all the time.
And
And
I think, and there's like a double-edged sword with that, like
yeah,
sort of like we talk about class and so forth, and it kind of can go both ways. Like you know,
right,
you can be an outsider if you don't sound exactly right, and so
exactly.
you're discriminated against by the local people. And then as you travel outside the region, I'll never forget the first time I went to New York and like a waitress saying like, taking my order and saying like, "Can you say that again?" So
Oh,
she's like
see,
fascinated by the way I was talking.
yeah, and
I
that
didn't understand what she was, they were kind of laughing and stuff. I didn't really understand.
well, and then I first lived on the West Coast in Seattle, and I that was a major wake up call in how other people thought of Appalachia.
Oh yeah.
Because I
Oh
had more
sure.
than one person say, "Oh, did you have any shoes?" And I was like, "You're kidding, right?"
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Like,
Well,
it's
and
2000s era Seattle, and y'all think that we didn't have shoes.
yeah, and I
What?
think I think the South as a whole is sort of seen as this homogenous place, and
It's
it's
so not.
absolutely not. It's very
Completely
diverse. I
not.
mean, people on the coasts are entirely different.
Totally, and the Piedmont too.
Accents are different. Piedmont's different,
Totally
and
different.
then you have just a variety of accents and different religious traditions and things like that.
Yeah.
Just be by virtue of so. But the South is seen that way, and the other thing you kind of see a lot of is assuming all of the South is rural. It's like, have you seen Atlanta? Have you seen like
Oh,
where
I
do
know.
you? There's just this
Yeah.
assumption. And I
Right.
kind of compare it. We all have these biases. I kind of compare it to the first time I went to New Jersey and I was in rural New Jersey, and I was like, my God, this place is beautiful. And of course, the state license plate says the Garden State. It is this beautiful place. It's
Yeah.
unbelievable. But from television, everything is like Newark is New Jersey, right?
Right.
That's all I knew. Sopranos, right? That's what was New Jersey. So
Well,
we all
LA's
we all have those like biases, and we have to. But we should try to have an open mind so that we can
oh, I know.
learn about different places.
I think one thing I really love about LA is that you think of LA from the movies, and you can be driving down and say, well, that looks really familiar. I've seen that.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
LA is sort of more of a universe and not a city
yes,
because you have these huge mountain ranges in the city. And then
yes,
there's wilderness, there's bears, there's mountain lions. I have wild parrots, 5 kinds of them here, and peacocks and
yeah.
coyotes. And so I didn't know that about LA. I didn't know that it was like this group of little universes of little towns.
I had
And
no
some of them,
idea. My daughter lived there for a while, so we
it's
hiked and went
crazy.
to Griffith Park and all the
Yeah,
things. So, I mean, I was like, wow, this is incredible. And I just had no
not what
idea.
you
It,
think.
it
Yeah,
was all going to be like,
just a
Hollywood,
freeway and palm
just a
trees.
freeway,
Yeah.
and no, it is a beautiful place.
It's interesting. Yeah. So, like, it's funny how we get these weird biases in our head. And it's not really.
Yeah, yeah.
The one thing about Appalachia is that it was like I mentioned the glaciation, and like all those high peaks. I mean, those were basically islands when people settled, came over
Hmm.
from the UK, and that's how those are different dialects. Because like Southwest Virginia sounds different from East Tennessee, sounds different
It's
from Eastern
true.
Kentucky, sounds different from Western North Carolina, and even among them in different counties, it's different
Absolutely,
accents. It's amazing,
absolutely.
and I'm kind of sad that that's vanishing. Uh,
Yeah, I am
so,
too.
and I think like let's tell these stories. Let's get these voices,
Yeah.
out there. And so now I want to know what's next for you. What's coming?
Well, I
Got
appreciate
this
that.
great book, which I can't wait for people to read.
Yeah, yeah. So the Weird Dark Things Grow comes out on September 10th. So doing
September
kind
10th.
of southeast tour a little bit, going to different towns and that kind of thing. But one exciting thing is there is a loose sequel to this novel, set in the same place with some overlapping characters, but it's set in the 1980s.
Oh, I can't
And
wait.
so, yeah, so the way that I kind of explain it to folks is um, this book would be like in that voice of my grandparents and the world of my grandparents. And then the second book is really my experience
Your
growing up in
childhood.
the 80s in this
Yeah.
area with some of those continuations of same
Uh,
religious traditions
yeah.
and views of the world. Still some dialect is still there, but it's different, obviously. 1980s teenagers in Western North Carolina watched all the same movies that everybody else did. And so we had,
Right.
all those influences on our language and dialect as
Had
well.
them
So
all.
that was a lot of fun to write. So that one, the fun thing for readers is that's coming out next fall. So
Great.
if you like this book, you have only 1 year to wait
Oh,
for
thank
the next one.
goodness.
Yeah, so that was pretty cool.
Very
Had a
cool.
few writers ask me about that. Well, how did you write these stuff? I was like, no, this took like 8 years to write these two books. So, it's been a long process. And, as you know, when you write your first book, there's a lot of failing and learning and all those kind of things. And, I workshopped the book in my MFA program and had tons
Yeah.
of beta readers. And it's nothing like that first draft. You
No.
wouldn't even recognize it.
Right. And that's fine.
So that's what's next for me.
Great.
Other than that, I've started work on a second poetry collection and a third
Excellent.
novel. So it's still a little bit of a tug of war of which one's going to get my time. And then also, I think having these two books come out within 2 years, I've spent a lot of time editing and doing things like that,
Oh, yeah.
working with the publisher on those things. So that's kind of taken me from creating the next thing. But I'm excited to get that editing done for the book coming next fall, and then get back into creating.
Great. Fantastic.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I truly can't wait till people read this, and I wish you the best success with it. And I would like to ask, where can readers find you online?
Yeah, probably the easiest thing to do is go to andrewkclark.com. That is my website. So it's ANDREWKCLARK.com. So
Great.
we are Clarks that used to have an E on our name in Scotland, and now we don't have the E. So that's probably the easiest place you can see like all the events and so forth. But I'm, on all the social medias like Instagram and so forth at the Andrew K. Clark. So
Perfect.
they can find me there, but there's links to those on the website. So that's probably the quickest way to see what's going on. Yeah.
Andrew, it's been a pleasure, and I
It's
thank
been a
you.
pleasure. And I have something that's kind of a push a little bit here. You said these Appalachian stories need to come out. And so I'm thinking like, you got to help me with some of these, the cosmic horror. I know there's probably some that I have of your work that I haven't read that might address that, but I'm thinking, yeah, I'm hearing you talk about your grandparents. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's funny, the Shadow Galaxy, my collection, that you
Yeah.
have under my Dotson pen name, people really responded, and interestingly, people in the UK powerfully responded to the Appalachian stories in there. They're not all
Very
Appalachia,
cool.
but there are
Yes.
some, the Appalachians are on the cover.
Yes. Yes.
But people really responded to the Appalachian stories in there, which I
Yeah.
I really want to tell. Like my novel that's coming out next year, Atacama, a lot of it takes place in East Tennessee,
Excellent.
away
Okay.
from that desert. It's all
Wonderful.
heading
Yeah.
to that. So I kind of dip into that a bit, but I am writing more things in the region. And I'm also wanting, because now I am a publisher of Stars
Yeah.
and Papers
Yeah.
Publishing, I'm wanting to publish some things
Very nice.
of
Very nice. We need,
Appalachian
we need
nature.
that. We need these voices. And
Yep.
so I
Including
think that's
poetry. So
amazing. Yeah, and I love that this book has poetry and fiction. Like
yeah.
to me, that's exciting, like that hybrid. And it sort of speaks to my little poet brain because I do both. So to me, it's like, I
Yeah.
like this in one collection. This is really cool.
Thank you. Well, thank you again, and we'll chat soon. I'd love to have you back to talk about your book when it comes out next year, because
Yes.
I think that that's going to resonate with a lot of Gen Xers, particularly, and
I'm hoping so.
young
It was a lot of fun to
millennials
write, and I think they'll have fun reading it.
and Gen Z. Like my kids are Gen Z, and I think that they'll eat that up because they love hearing the stories from that time. So,
Yeah, I think so. So
right.
thank you so much. I appreciate this.
You. All right.